Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you for joining us. My name is Elliot Derringer. I am the Executive Vice President of C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We're very pleased today to welcome you all to this latest C2ES webinar, looking inside the Paris Rulebook. COP24 last month in Katowice, Poland, was the most significant moment in the international climate negotiations since the Paris Summit in 2015. C2ES has been deeply engaged in the climate negotiations for many years. In the year running up to COP24, we organized a series of in-depth workshops for lead negotiators to help them work through the many issues in the Paris Rulebook. In November, we published a report based on those discussions outlining what we saw as the essential elements of the Paris Rulebook. And last month, following the COP, we posted a summary of its major outcomes. You can find both of those publications at c2es.org. Today, we'll take a look at some of the key outcomes in Katowice, as well as some of the business left undone. And we're very pleased to have with us two of the world's leading experts to help us as we look inside the Paris Rulebook. I'll begin with a brief overview of the Paris Agreement and Rulebook and our assessment of what was achieved in Katowice. We'll then turn to Sue Biniaz. Sue was for many years the lead climate lawyer at the U.S. Department of State. She remains deeply engaged in international climate discussions, including as a C2ES Senior Adviser. Sue will speak to the mitigation, transparency, and compliance elements of the Paris Rulebook. We'll then hear from Dirk Forrister. Dirk has a long history of engagement in climate issues in both the public and private sectors. He is currently the president and CEO of AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association. Dirk will speak to the one major area where parties were unable to reach agreement in Katowice, the rules for implementing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which addresses the use of market approaches. Following their presentations, we'll invite questions from all of you, and I'll provide information at that time on how you can submit your questions. I thought it would be helpful to begin with a very brief recap of the nature of the Paris Agreement. Paris is often described as a hybrid agreement because it incorporates both bottom-up and top-down elements. It is bottom-up in the sense that each country sets its own national targets or commitments, known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. To help steer these efforts and to promote accountability and ambition, the agreement also includes a number of top-down elements. These include a set of long-term goals addressing mitigation, adaptation, and finance, a binding commitment by all parties to maintain an NDC and to pursue domestic measures with the aim of achieving it, a binding commitment by all parties to periodically report on their emissions and on the implementation of their NDCs and to undergo international review, and an ongoing cycle that every 5 years provides for a global stocktake to assess collective progress toward the agreement's long-term goals, followed by the submission of updated NDCs. Parties gave themselves 3 years to negotiate the detailed rules and procedures for implementing the broad provisions of the Paris Agreement. Those negotiations concluded at COP24 with the adoption of a 100-page rulebook addressing, among other things, mitigation, adaptation, finance, transparency, implementation and compliance, and the global stocktake. As I mentioned, parties did not reach agreement on the rules for implementing Article 6. They deferred those decisions to COP25, which will take place in Santiago, Chile, either later this year or early next year. From our perspective, COP24 delivered a solid outcome, particularly given the broader geopolitical context. By that, I refer not only to the United States' declared intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but also to the many issues that have emerged since Paris that have weakened and distracted other governments and have diminished high-level leadership on climate change. Despite those challenges, parties achieved what they needed to in order to make Paris a functioning multilateral agreement. The United States, for its part, remained deeply engaged in negotiations, playing what might be described as a dual role. On the one hand, the U.S. blocked stronger language on the recent IPCC report, highlighting the risks of warming exceeding 1.5 degrees, and on the need for greater ambition in the next round of NDCs due in 2020. On the other hand, the U.S. arguably pushed harder than any other country for strong transparency rules in the Paris Rulebook. Looking forward, apart from the continued negotiations on Article 6 and other issues at COP25, attention will now turn to the summit being convened this September by UN Secretary General Guterres to help strengthen ambition as parties prepare their next round of NDCs. With that overview, I'd now like to introduce Sue Biniaz, who, as I said, will speak to mitigation, transparency, and compliance.
Thank you, Elliot. Let me start with the first issue of mitigation. The main issue there, it's kind of a mouthful. It's information for clarity, transparency, and understanding, also known as ICTU or ICTU. Now, what that's about is about making nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, clear. And it's kind of an outgrowth of the targets that were submitted by parties under the Copenhagen Accord and Cancun Agreement. They were not very clear. It took about a year of workshops to even figure out what parties had committed to. So going into Paris, it was definitely a high priority to improve the clarity of NDCs. So the Paris Agreement included a legally binding requirement for parties to submit the necessary information for clarity, transparency, and understanding along with their NDCs. And the decision that accompanied the Paris Agreement, so that sort of subsidiary document, it included a short list of information that might be necessary. It didn't say it will be necessary, left it a little bit open. So in Katowice at the COP, there were a number of issues surrounding ICTU. One was whether to expand that short list. If so, how to expand it. In other words, what kind of information should be included with an NDC to make it clear, and whether that list should be binding, legally binding on parties. It should also be noted that there were a small group of parties that argued for different developed and developing country requirements on ICTU, which the U.S. and others pushed back against very, very strongly. The notion that you would have differentiated clarity just made absolutely no sense. In addition to the fact that Paris kind of moved beyond the bifurcation between developed and developing countries, yet it was an issue to be dealt with. So what was the outcome? The COP agreed on an extensive list of information necessary for clarity, more than I think most people expected, and that was a good thing. It's binding on each party, but there's a little bit of discretion in there because it's binding on each party, quote unquote, as applicable to its particular NDC. Now that's sort of a recognition that not all kinds of information are necessary for each particular kind of NDC. So parties will have a little bit of discretion there to pick out what from the list that which makes sense for their particular NDC. And there is no bifurcation between developed and developing countries. And so I'd say the U.S. and others were very successful in pushing back on that. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to pivot to the next issue, which is the transparency framework, or the enhanced transparency framework, as it's called, under the Paris Agreement. Now, this was almost the toughest nut to crack for a number of reasons. It mostly length and sort of technical detail. It had the most issues embedded in it, and because the process essentially gave the same amount of time to each issue involved in the Paris Rulebook, transparency didn't really have enough time to deal with all the issues it had to deal with. There were a lot of workshops that took place on the side, many of them convened by C2ES, to try to get through all the necessary issues. So what is the transparency framework? It includes both reporting and review. And, to make matters more complicated, reporting included several different kinds of reporting. Reporting on greenhouse gas inventories and reporting on tracking progress on your NDC and other forms of reporting. And then the review also had two different components. There's the technical review, which is also called TER, Technical Expert Review. And there's also peer review, which is more at the political level. That's the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, which takes place after the technical review. So, between the different kinds of reporting and the different kinds of review, you can see why it was a very complicated negotiation. And in addition to all those technical issues, the negotiations had to address the quote-unquote flexibility issue. Now, what that was that the Paris Agreement, and this language derived from the U.S.-China joint statement that preceded Paris by a couple months. The Paris Agreement said that within the transparency framework, there would be flexibility for those developing countries that need it in the light of their capacities. So not all developing countries, and not for any reason, but for capacity reasons, there would be some flexibility. And the parties had to decide, well, who would get this flexibility? What kind of flexibility would it be? And, how long would it last? And that took quite a bit of work to nail down. So next slide, please. Before getting to the outcome, I would just note that the U.S. and China co-facilitated the negotiation. And they did a masterful job, and I would say it came out very favorably from a U.S. perspective. First of all, the transparency regime, it's quite detailed. It's about 35 pages long. I think more than anyone would have expected, even a couple months before the COP. It moves way beyond the existing bifurcated system. At the moment, you've got different systems for developed and developing countries. Now there's only one system. In terms of the flexibility, it's quite limited. It only applies to certain provisions or certain aspects of the transparency framework, mostly related to GHG inventory reporting. In addition, which is a good feature, for each form of flexibility, there's a floor. In other words, it doesn't just say if you have a capacity need, you don't have to do X. It says if you don't have the capacity to do X, then you must do Y. So there's some, minimum thing that each party needs to do. Each party decides whether it needs the flexibility based on capacity. There was really no way to come up with criteria that would apply because it depends on what type of provision, whether a country might have the capacity or not. But a country has to affirmatively invoke flexibility. It doesn't just get it automatically. And it has to do it on a provision by provision basis. So there's no such thing as a party saying, I opt for flexibility. You have to clearly indicate I need it here and here, on a provision by provision basis. Next slide, please. Okay, moving to the third issue, which is the so-called Implementation and Compliance Committee. The Paris Agreement, there wasn't that much to negotiate under this article because the Paris Agreement decided many aspects of how this committee would operate, including its basic nature, which is facilitative, non-punitive. It doesn't have any binding authority. It can't tell a party, you must do this, you must do that. So that was already kind of nailed down. Its composition was nailed down, et cetera, et cetera. So there wasn't that much to do. The main issues were what kind of questions or issues get referred to the committee and how. And the outcomes include basically four routes to getting to the committee. First, and this is fairly non-controversial, as you can imagine, a party can raise an issue with respect to itself, with respect to its own implementation and compliance, and ask for some kind of assistance or guidance from the committee. Fine. The second one is that the body of all the parties, the so-called CMA, can refer a systemic issue to the committee, which is basically an issue that involves all or most parties, not an individual party. And an example of that would be many parties are late in their reporting. Why is that? The Conference of the Parties, the CMA, might ask the committee to look into that as a systemic issue. The third category, which took some fine-tuning, was the category of commitments that have no other place to go. They don't go through the transparency process. So if a party never hands in an NDC in the first place, there would be nothing to be reviewed under the transparency process. Or if it hands in an NDC, but then it never reports on how it's doing in its implementation, there would again be nothing to review in the transparency process. So parties were concerned about like this big loophole. If you didn't allow that to go to this committee, there'd be no place to take a look at whether, a party that had basically not implemented a very important commitment under the agreement. So the committee has discretion to take up certain issues, such as not handing in an NDC or never reporting at all. And then lastly, in narrow circumstances, and this was probably the most controversial aspect of what could go to the committee, because some countries didn't want this to go at all in any circumstances, the committee can take up in its discretion an issue that has already gone through the transparency process if there's sort of repeated, persistent, bad reporting. Okay, so over and over a party reports badly. It can be taken up by the committee. There are some constraints on the ability of the committee to take it up, primarily that it requires the consent of the party, but presumably there would be some slight embarrassment factor if a party said, no, we don't consent to taking up that issue. So, that was the resolution of that last most controversial issue. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Turning now to Dirk for a readout on Article 6.
Thanks, Elliot. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, let's go ahead and move to the first slide then. First of all, it's a pleasure to join this call and to be with Sue and Elliot again on this set of important topics. The Article 6 discussions did not go quite as positively as others. Just to make sure we're all on the same starting point, there are three basic components to Article 6. First of all, it's all about voluntary cooperation between parties in reaching their NDCs. And as part of that, the first thing that they have agreed to do is to provide accounting guidance for how you would report imports and exports into this transparency framework that Sue described. And this is all around what a kind of would be defined as internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. But again, it's those that get transferred and how they would be reflected in reports. Obviously, this is something that market people care about because we want integrity in the system and want to make sure that units aren't being used more than once. So it's all about avoiding double counting. This particular provision is something that requires sort of, the idea of having guidance is sort of a nice to have, but not, you can still move forward with cooperative approaches without this, just because the way it's described in the Paris Agreement is that you have to act consistent with the guidance. If they never produce guidance, then presumably you're at least consistent with whatever is there. The 6.4 section is actually about running an emissions mitigation mechanism that would issue units for programs or activities that a country undertakes that produces these mitigation outcomes that could then be transferred. This is akin to the CDM, but hopefully new and improved, but a way that countries could quantify particular activities that reduce emissions in their country that they want to make available to sell. This requires a lot more than 6.2 does, because this actually requires that they stand up a mechanism, that they set up an executive board, they have governance, they have a process and and the mechanics for reviewing projects and issuing credits, that kind of thing. Then finally, the third leg of the stool, if you will, is a work program for non-market approaches. This is an area that's been a little less well-defined, but there are some countries that want to cooperate on things that would not involve transferable units, and they want a way of accounting for that as well. So these are the three legs of the stool. Let's move to the next slide. In terms of the issues that were on the table in Katowice, basically everything was still open when they arrived, both technical issues and political issues. These had appeared in a set of texts. I think the first one appeared in March last year. They refined it in their mid-year meetings in both Bonn in mid-year and then in September in Thailand. So they had a fairly well-organized draft to work with by the time they got to Katowice. They worked for the first 10 days to resolve all of the technical issues that they could so that they could refine it down to just a handful of more political issues to go to ministers. However, it was a real mixed bag in what they were divided on. I'll walk through these quickly, and then you can ask questions if you have, if you want more detail. But one of them was around what they call the share of the proceeds and overall mitigation. These are two topics that in the Paris Agreement relate primarily to the 6.4 mechanism. One is that they would deduct a certain number of units called the share of proceeds that could be used for administering the program and could be monetized to create cash to run the program, and a share of the proceeds to go into an adaptation fund. This exists in the CDM, so it's really bringing across that model. But also this concept of overall mitigation was being pushed by some of the small island countries as being an additional discount to ensure that the mechanism is going even further and providing extra global benefits. This was a real dividing line with a lot of the countries that might be on the buy side, because they sort of believe that conservative baselines and the fact that every country has an NDC and you're going to be going beyond the NDC, that was assuring overall mitigation in and of itself. One of the challenging things was the AOSIS countries wanted to add these provisions not just to 6.4 transfers, but also to 6.2 transfers, which would imply that you would have discounts in, that would get retroactively applied to existing programs, which was a big sticking point, for example, for the EU or Korea or even Canada and California. Another issue was about inside and outside of NDCs. This is some countries' NDCs don't cover their whole economy, so should they be allowed to create tradable units for things that were outside their NDC? This is a real sticking point because you want to make sure that you're doing proper accounting and that you're making corresponding adjustments in your accounts for units that are exported. But if it's coming out of a sector that's not got any accounting around it, what would you then adjust? So it's a pretty controversial thing about whether you should allow crediting outside. Flip side of it is the crediting mechanism could actually help you to quantify things that are not yet in an NDC. So there's a virtue in that. Another issue was around non-NDC uses of these tradable units, of the ITMOs. Mainly people are thinking about CORSIA, the aviation industry program that the International Civil Aviation Organization is planning to run. How should those be accounted for? If they're being used for CORSIA, then you wouldn't want them to be double used in toward a national commitment in this program, in the Article 6 program. CDM transition, another big issue. There's a number of projects that are in existence that have not reached the end of their crediting lifetime. There are also banked credits that some parties would like to see forwarded into the new Article 6 system. There could be, for example, some kind of a requalification program or some kind of a you could imagine a decision-making process where things get reviewed and could potentially have a future life. but a whole set of issues around that that could affect the supply and demand balance. And then finally, this issue of corresponding adjustments and whether it's applied just to trades under the 6.2 program, which is kind of thought of as the universe where allowance trading programs that link up would tally up their imports and exports, or the question is whether that should also apply to the 6.4 mechanism. I think most people in the business community have always assumed that it would, but Brazil had a different view, which I'll talk about in a moment. Next slide. In terms of, excuse me, where things ended up, the ministers worked until the bitter end. I think this was one of the reasons the talks were delayed for an additional day, trying to find a way out of this set of concerns. Brazil, however, never moved, refused all of the compromises. I think going in, we weren't really sure whether a lot of the issues in Article 6 were maybe linked to things in the transparency framework or reporting programs that Sue described. Or whether they stood in isolation. I guess what you sort of, or we sort of learned in it is that they were distinct and sort of stood on their own because the rest of the things were able to move forward without getting compromises on Article 6. The big issue Brazil reportedly has, and I've spoken to them about it, I think this is the big concern, is that in their minds, when they agreed to Article 6 in Paris, they never thought that they would be making adjustments for project-based reductions that happened in the mechanism of 6.4. In other words, they saw it that provision would operate like the CDM does, where you don't have to take account of a reduction that's made in your economy. I don't think many in the OECD saw it that way. They saw this more like a program where it would quantify your ITMO and help you that way, but it would still be required to be accounted for. But Brazil's really serious about this. They think it's different, and that that was their understanding in Paris. There was high-level diplomacy with Brazil. I think reportedly the Secretary General was calling at the highest levels to try to break this impasse. But you'll all know that Brazil has had elections recently, so they're in the midst of a transition period between the old government and the new government. That may have played into it as well. But the bottom line is, if you look through the 100-page rulebook that Sue and Elliot described, there's no section on Article 6. What you do have is a basic accounting reference that relates to Articles 4 and 13 about how countries would do that basic accounting for transfers that we think of as kind of the 6.2 universe. They did acknowledge the progress that was made on the text, and it was referenced in a footnote. Actually, they referenced two versions of the text that were released on different days, and they basically punted it to next year, saying we're going to work through 2019 and come back at COP25 to resolve Article 6. Next slide. I just want to show you briefly what we did get, which is in this Article 13 section on transparency and reporting. And it basically, if you dig into that detail on the right-hand side of the slide, shows that how you would report for imports and exports. So if you're importing, then your account balance is your responsibility gets easier. So you take a subtraction, and if you're exporting, an addition. And this is how most of the parties wanted to deal with it. I think this is a actually useful provision for those that are thinking of system linkages into the future. And as I see it, there's sort of a clear pathway for moving forward with system linkages under 6.2. That could even include use of independent standards like the Verified Carbon Standard in the United States, for example, or the American Carbon Registry, California's Carbon Action Reserve. Those could be utilized in 6.2 for quantifying reductions on projects if countries wanted to do that, and then accounting for them using this language kind of in a 6.2 context. But the big missing element is actually having an operational mechanism at UN level. and that will be delayed for another year. Next slide. So going forward, we'll have mid-year meetings. I think they're in June this time in Bonn, when they will work through the remaining issues on Article 6 and hopefully resolve some of those outstanding things. They'll come back together at COP25, be it in end of this year or early next year. Typically, we'll have a first week of that when sort of staff level negotiators do their work, and then hopefully a few remaining issues would go to ministers in the second part of that. This year, Article 6 may be the biggest issue they have to deal with in terms of substance. I think in the meantime, there's lots of work that parties can do to start exploring cooperation. At the end of COP24, we saw the EU and New Zealand enter an agreement to explore market cooperation. EU has already signed a similar agreement with California and also has a working relationship with China and with Korea. So there are a number of things already in place. Similarly, the G7 has a carbon market platform that meets annually to explore common issues, and the carbon pricing of the Americas declaration countries are also have a regular forum for exploring cooperation. As I said, the 6.4 mechanism stalled for another year, but there are still other systems to work with, including the CDM and the Kyoto mechanisms that are still open for business. And at the end of the day, I think what it means is that the more detailed rules for 6.4 are going to have to catch up with the real world and kind of reflect what, or find a way of reflecting the good practices that are being used in the real world. I'll quickly hit on two other slides that I think just I wanted to show just to underscore the importance of this article. And this is from some economic modeling work that appeared last year, led by Jay Edmonds and his team at the University of Maryland at the Joint Global Change Research Institute. And they presented this at a forum that IETA and EPRI and the International Energy Agency hold every year in Paris. They did it in November. And this just sort of shows some of the economic value around working independently versus working together. And over the course of the century, they show that you can cut the prices more than in half through these forms of cooperation. And move on to the next slide. You also see that it benefits virtually everyone, both on the buy side and the sell side, as it makes the targets both easier to reach, but also could inspire greater ambition. And this sort of shows who buyers and sellers are. And some countries like China start out as a seller and then end up as a buyer. It's obviously of great importance to the US and Europe, but also to some of our other OECD partners. And then where you see sellers, you see where there's other low-cost mitigation, at least in the economic modeling universe, that could help to enable countries to achieve their targets and hopefully aspire to greater ambitions going forward. I wanted to show these just to say that I think last year is the first time that we actually started to see much numerical analysis around the importance of Article 6 and what it's worth. This will be of great benefit, I think, to negotiators going forward next year. If you can imagine, they've gotten this far and working this number of years just with qualitative assumptions, but without benefiting from some of the economic literature that could really help them. So we'll be undertaking a project going forward this year that we'll be hopefully working with C2ES on, but also with Jay Edmonds and his team and a number of private sector and Article 6 negotiators and economic modeling experts to really explore what rule sets do we need and what does it take to unlock this full potential. So thank you, and I'll stop for questions.
Great, thanks, Dirk. The questions are coming in, and I'm going to start with a couple for you, Dirk. First, from Tim Mealy. Were there other countries in addition to Brazil who were holdouts on the Article 6 negotiations? And a second question from Jessica Lund. Could you please say a little more about the Corsia issue and possibilities for resolution? Okay.
On Tim's question, the I think Brazil was the main stumbling block, but in the bitter end, we understood that there were some others that has shared concerns that were out of the sort of I think sort of the BRIC countries that Brazil coordinates with. Whether those were, I mean, I think they may have just been supporting them politically, but reportedly there were some others, but it was led by Brazil. And when Brazil wouldn't say yes, it meant that some of the countries that had been giving, caving into compromises, be it from AOSIS or from Europe or from the Umbrella Group, they all kind of reclaimed ground that they had expressed willingness to compromise on. So everybody kind of went back into their corners. So I think when we come back in mid-year, it's probably going to be, it'll feel like we've stepped back a step until they decide to all step to the middle again. And Jessica, to your question about what does it mean for CORSIA? I mean, CORSIA, at least the appearance was that they sort of were working hard on their program this autumn on deciding how they were going to move forward in recognizing different programs. And they sort of hit the pause button to allow space and time for the Article 6 negotiations to reach fruition. Unfortunately for them, I think that didn't happen. It is a lot of the same players, and it is definitely all of the same countries. What it actually means for them, I think the way I viewed it is that the independent standards are kind of up and ready to run. They would like to get blessed by the ICAO process so that they could start start their preparations for being players in the implementation. Project developers are definitely disappointed that they don't have clearer understanding of what the rules are so that they can go out and start implementing projects and harvesting reductions to bring to market. But so I think the delay doesn't help on the CORSIA side. At the same time, those that are interested in moving forward, there is still a basis for doing that, I think, with the independent standards and potentially with the CDM. Although I think there's a little more risk around the CDM because it is one of the things that they're actually going to have to arrive at decisions on. So anyway, that's my assessment of it.
Thanks, Dirk, and my apologies to all of you who have been awaiting instructions on how to submit questions. A number of you obviously have already figured that out, but for those of you not familiar with GoToWebinar, you will see the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your computer screen. If you don't see it displayed, you can click the orange arrow to expand it, and on that panel, you can expand the questions option by clicking the small arrow next to the word questions. And there you can type in your question, and we'll try to get to each of these or as many as we can before we wrap up at 2 p.m. So next I wanted to turn to a couple of questions for Sue. First from Alice Thomas, who comprises the Compliance Committee? Does it include civil society organizations or other non-government agencies? And then a question from Esther Badiola. How did the U.S. behave during the COP? In other words, do you see the U.S. meeting the Paris Agreement, even if the country leaves the Paris Agreement? And how will it influence the COPs going forward?
Thanks, Elliot. On the issue of the Compliance Committee, it's only parties, so there is no non-governmental participation. It's spelled out in the Paris Agreement what the composition is, and I believe it's 12 members nominated by parties, and there's some geographical distribution, so you're not going to have everybody from the same part of the world. And you also have a variety of different areas of expertise, so, law, policy, technical, et cetera. So that's all spelled out, but there's no direct participation. Obviously, non-governmental groups can, find other ways to say things about potential non-compliance or non-implementation. The second issue was about the U.S. I thought the U.S. was very influential. I mean, Elliot already pointed out that there were kind of, on ambition issues, the U.S. was, not what you would call progressive, I guess, in terms of referencing the IPCC 1.5 report, in terms of calling for enhanced action. The U.S. was kind of hostile to those things. But in terms of the rule book itself, I would say the U.S. was very, was promoting sort of what I would consider maybe time-honored U.S. positions, bipartisan positions, strong on transparency, strong on level playing field, anti-bifurcation, that strong on clarity. I would have found very little difference between, positions the U.S. used to advocate and the positions that were advocated at this COP on those issues. On ambition, of course, it was a completely different story. In terms of the future, the next COP will take place after the date on which the U.S. could, in theory, submit its notification of withdrawal. And at that point, I don't know that other countries will be as amenable to following the U.S. lead. Maybe they will be, because they'll maybe figure that even if this administration decides to withdraw, a future administration may decide to rejoin, and therefore it's still in other countries' interest to, sort of go with bipartisan U.S. positions to not remove the possibility of future U.S. participation. But I think that's kind of an open question.
And just to add on Esther's question about whether we see the U.S. meeting the Paris Agreement, if you are referring to the NDC put forward by the U.S. Under the Obama administration, which calls for a reduction of about 26% to 28% in emissions by 2025. The latest projections do not show the U.S. on track to achieve that level of reduction, and that, of course, is more a function of U.S. domestic policy. So that will require greater progress at home if we're to put ourselves on track to come closer to meeting that 2025 goal. Next, I've got one question for Dirk and one for Sue. Well, actually, you might both choose to speak to both. One question from Esther Wielden. Will the lack of the Article 6 market mechanism hurt the chances of countries increasing the ambition of their NDCs in 2020, and why or why not? And secondly, a question from Jeff Brower. Aside from markets, what will be the major issues or sticking points for the negotiations over the next few years? Dirk, why don't we toss that to you first?
Okay, I think on the question about ambition, I do think countries want to know what flexibilities they have to work with, and sort of what's the rule set going to be. What's going to be available in terms of market mechanisms before they think about raising ambitions. This is one of the most interesting parts of the work being undertaken on the economic modeling side. Is you can look at it through the lens of how much cost savings potential there is, or as Environmental Defense Fund has done recently in a really fascinating report, you can say, okay, if you take the existing commitments and say that's an expression of willingness to pay, and you said, what if you cooperated but spent that amount of money, how much more could you get done? And they showed that you could nearly double the ambition by 2030 of what countries could do together. So you do need to know those flexibilities. I think the interesting part beyond that is just that with this sort of basic provision on accounting and kind of the freedom to do your own program, your own cooperative approach with others in a club kind of context, then you've got a clear path forward under 6.2. So nothing holds you back. So I do think now we've got kind of a basic rule and some legitimacy under that for countries to start planning and looking to more cooperation, which could definitely set the stage for enhancing ambitions. I'll let Sue take the second question because I am so focused on the heavy hurdle to get over on Article 6 that some of the other things that still remain you may have a better view on, Sue.
Yeah, just on Article 6, just to agree with Dirk on the sort of legal distinction between 6.2 and 6.4. You know, parties will not know whether this new CDM will be available to them. So to the extent that that's important to them, it might affect their enhancement of ambition. But 6.2, as Dirk says, doesn't require anything more. I mean, you can add more guidance, but we never wrote it to authorize transfers or trading in the first place. So it simply recognizes that parties may voluntarily cooperate. So there's nothing in there that prevents countries from engaging in cooperation. They have to engage in robust accounting, so that's a requirement, and that has to be consistent with guidance if it ever emerges. But you know, to the extent that their enhanced ambition depends upon transfers of, you know, allowances or reduction units from other countries, not from this new CDM, then they have that ability right now. In terms of this coming year, you know, there's a rather technical exercise going on, or that has to go on under the transparency framework. It has a boring name called Common Reporting Formats. You know, and that's basically kind of coming up with a chart or a way for everybody to be able to report in a fairly harmonized, simple way, you know, but in the climate negotiations, as we all know, everything turns into a production. So even though that might seem like a simple technical exercise, that will probably consume a lot of negotiating effort. And then there's going to be a review of the loss and damage mechanism, the Warsaw International Mechanism. So that, you know, will have a technical component and some political components, and then, of course, Article 6. And then, you know, this year also, on top of what's going on under the Paris Agreement, you've got the UN Secretary General Summit. So that will, of course, absorb some of the climate attention during 2019.
Thanks. Again, a question for each of you. First to Dirk, a clarifying question from Rob Stowe. Was Brazil's position that all 6.4 units could be sold with no corresponding adjustment, or that only 6.4 units outside the NDC could be sold with no corresponding adjustment? And then for Sue, a question from Alexandra Guerra. How should U.S. organizations who have voluntarily signed up for the Paris Agreement participate when the U.S. does not report NDCs?
Okay, so
sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to respond to Rob Stowe and say, I think it's, if I understand them right, I think it's for any 6.4 transfer, and the reason for that is that Brazil, I mean, part of where they're coming from is that they feel like they did the right thing of putting forward an economy-wide NDC themselves, and they don't want to be penalized if people that didn't do that are able to credit things outside the NDC and not doing a corresponding adjustment. So they view it that if they're doing things and they've not done an economy-wide, they still shouldn't have to do the corresponding adjustment. And this is to the earlier question about whether other countries were kind of in coalition with Brazil on that point. We know, for example, China doesn't think that. China's got economy-wide, but also has a belief that you should do corresponding adjustment for both. So the others that Brazil has in their corner were not completely clear on who they are or how deeply they feel about it. So I'll let you take the other question.
Yeah, just on the Brazil question, it's a nuance that I heard that haven't completely wrapped my head around, but my understanding was Brazil is saying that in order for something to require a transfer to require a corresponding adjustment, it needs to be covered by your NDC and also regulated as a domestic matter. Like, it needs to be a regulated sector, so that if it's in your NDC, but it's not regulated domestically, those transfers should not count against you. But once I figure out what that means, I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk about it. Okay, Elliot, back to the other question. I didn't catch the last couple words of what you said. What should be the role of non-state actors with the U.S. what?
Let me maybe restate that a little more generally. How can U.S. organizations remain engaged on the Paris Agreement if and when the U.S. withdraws?
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of platforms associated with the Paris Agreement and not associated with the Paris Agreement, but let's just stick to the ones associated with Paris, like the NASCA portal, and there's all kinds of, the action days and the climate champions and all of that. There are all kinds of ways for non-state actors and, companies, subnational governments, et cetera, to participate that don't require that your, national government be a party to the agreement. So I think those should continue to be available to U.S. non-state actors.
Great, thanks. Another one for you, Sue, this from Nilesh Nerurkar. How long will it take for all countries to go through the review process so we can see how well it's working out?
Boy, I don't really have an answer to that off the top of my head. I'd have to look into it.
Okay. A couple of questions on how to access some information. Dirk, there was a question as to whether the slides, the report that you showed, the slides from the University of Maryland report, whether that is available online. And we also had a question on where people could obtain a copy of the rule book. On that, I'm not sure that the Secretariat, the UNFCCC Secretariat, has finished the final formatting of the decisions, but if you go to the UNFCCC website, which is unfccc.int, on the home page there, you will see a button for Outcomes of COP24, and then under CMA, you'll see a link called, actually, it's unfortunately the pieces of the rule book are distributed in several places. You'll see lots of links on that page, and the various components of the rule book can be accessed there. Hopefully, at some point, there will be a reformatting that will make it easier to find it all in one place. So, Dirk, on the question of the UMD report, is that available online?
It is. It is available on the IEA has a website that, and Elliot, maybe I can send you the link. I should have put it in the presentation, but there is a version of this that was presented in Paris in November. Along with the presentation from Environmental Defense Fund and one from EPRI, kind of all with different takes on this topic. So I can send you that link, and then we will also, by the end of this week, I think, have posted the versions that were presented at the COP that will be on our website. So stay tuned on that one, but I can send you the IEA link.
Great. So you can find that posting later at aida.org. We're going to squeeze in one last question for you, Dirk, and this is from Angela Foster Rice. Is there a risk of the new CDM instrument, the Article 6.4 mechanism, becoming irrelevant since ITMOs can move ahead without it?
I think there is, although one of the things I'll say about it is you never underestimate the power of the UN imprimatur that will be on that mechanism. So I think the pressure's on for them to get it set up and to get it up and running. But it was one of the things that I pressed negotiators hard on in Katowice, is that the clock's ticking, and for this thing to maintain its relevance, they really need to. They needed to stand up an executive board and actually get a board to start doing work for them, but they didn't get there. So I do think it plays to the advantage of some of the independent systems that have a lot of veracity and that are already being utilized by governments from California to Colombia, and I know South Africa is looking at use of VCS credits. So it's a different construct. They've got some competition now in terms of other standards and programs that have a lot of governmental support and confidence. So anyway, I also always have this memory of some of you may know Abid Karmali, who's one of my board members from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and Abid always talks about how with the CDM he was able to convince Merrill Lynch to invest in countries that they otherwise wouldn't have gone because it was a UN program. And so I think that's one thing that the new mechanism will have as an advantage, and one of the reasons that we all need for it to succeed.
Great, thanks, Dirk. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Our thanks to both Sue and Dirk for taking the time to join us today and sharing their thoughts. I hope we've made a dent, at least, in answering the questions you have about the rule book. We will be posting the slides and audio from the webinar at c2es.org. You can find that by going to the events link on the home page. We have lots of additional materials regarding the Paris Agreement and Rulebook on the website, again, c2es.org. I encourage you to check those out. And if you have any further questions for us at C2ES or for the panelists, please feel free to reach out to us at press. You can email us at press@c2es.org. That's press@c2es.org, and we'll do our best to help. And thanks again to all of you for joining us.